Welcome to the HIT Podcast, H.I.T, Human Resources, Insurance, and Technology. I'm your host, Toby Kennedy. As we do every week, we're dropping into your feed with what I hope are bite-sized, digestible, really well-curated conversations going on in the space. This week's episode will be no exception. I'm very excited for our guest this week. This week's episode is brought to you by Montage Insurance Solutions. And without any further ado, let's get right into it. First of all, Sherli, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
I'm so excited to have you too. So Sherli is an attorney that is a dear friend of someone I've worked with for years and years and years. And it's one of those like, you two need to meet. And we did, and we chatted about some of the stuff that I'm really excited that you're an expert in that we can dive into today. But Sherli, just real quick, like the nickel tour high level, what's the Sherli show? How do you get in the chair today?
So I'm an employment attorney, and I specialize in workplace investigations. So I'm the person that's called in whenever there's a complaint internally about harassment or discrimination or other wrongful conduct, and I do an investigation regarding that complaint.
I think that's such a relevant topic to so many of our audience who are in human resources, who have these things come up. And so I guess kind of disclaimer, not legal advice, disclaimer. But as you're sort of in this world and have been practicing for such a long time, maybe just to start us off with, can you tell me a couple things that like HR needs to know, or a couple places you see are consistent pitfalls or some best practices? Like what comes to your mind if we were at a cocktail party, you said you're in investigations, and I said, keep talking?
A lot would come to my mind.
Let's do it.
So I'm typically brought in when there's the complaint relates to a high-level employee, a board member, an executive. But typically, companies conduct their internal investigations for most of their complaints internally with an HR representative, right? So I'm also brought in sometimes when a company doesn't have an internal HR representative who's properly qualified or trained to conduct the investigation. So if there's any, employers that are listening right now, this is a really good time to look into that. Yeah. We'll definitely talk about some pitfalls. Investigations cross every industry, every company size. So it really is a topic that impacts all employers, especially in California.
Yeah. What are some of the spots that you see when HR's doing things that you're like, boy, if I could have gotten this phone call a little earlier, I would have advised for this or against this? Like, what are some of the pro tips?
Okay, so pro tip number one, conduct the investigation. So your first pitfall, right, is not conducting the investigation to begin with, right? So not all complaints need a formal investigation. There's several factors that the employer should really look at, including the severity of the allegations, whether the allegations are really even in dispute. But for our California employers, we have what's called FEHA. FEHA stands for the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And FEHA mandates prompt, thorough, and fair investigations of claims that relate to harassment, discrimination, or retaliation. So in these instances, employers are really mandated to conduct this investigation. So that's your first pitfall to avoid. Make sure you do that investigation if it's required.
Yeah,
right?
And I'm curious as you unpack that, the retaliation piece to me seems like it might be the one that has some of the thorns in it that rears up. I think that, and maybe I'm a little naive, but I hope and believe and pray that we're kind of in a world where maybe the discrimination and harassment isn't like it was yesterday, sort of a thing. Hopefully managers are better trained, although I could see if you're audio only, she's making a face like TK. It's still a rough world out there. Well, then maybe let's unpack that and get into the retaliation piece.
It's still a rough world out there.
Oh boy. All right.
Yeah, the majority of my investigations do relate to discrimination and harassment. Retaliation is certainly an issue that comes up as well. Yeah, it's still out there.
Is it because it's still that same old school, like I'm picturing like the Mad Men era, like, way that we're treating people, or has the definition evolved in ways that trip people up a little more than you'd think.
Yes, both.
Yeah.
So because these concepts of harassment, discrimination and retaliation are really used broadly within society, people tend to think that they have the same meaning as their legal meanings, which
Mm.
they don't, right? The term harassment, discrimination, retaliation, these are terms of art. They're legal terms of art. And what that means is that there's legal definitions that apply to these terms that are often very different than what the average layperson thinks. So, an employee may think that certain conduct is discriminatory and
Mm.
they'll raise a complaint. It may not be, but from the employer perspective, they're more likely than not going to have to look into the complaint. They're going to
Mm.
have to do an investigation into the complaint, right?
Is that the direction of confusion you see most often? So I'm thinking about a behavior and I'm wondering if it's more often that the person thinks I'm being harassed, I'm being discriminated against, brings it up, and they had the wrong definition, or more often that the person doing the action is indeed harassing, is indeed discriminating, and thinks, I didn't know that. Well, that's not what I would have called harassment or discrimination. So, sort of the perpetrator in this side of the equation is the one being surprised by the definition being different than you might use it in everyday terms.
So, from the investigation perspective, I'm never making a determination of law.
Yeah.
And I'm really there just as a third party neutral investigator to determine what more likely than not occurred in this particular incident
Mm.
without applying any legal terms to it, right? It's just a finding of fact. What more likely than not occurred, and you can't make that finding of fact until you talk to all the relevant parties and until you go through all the evidence, right? But your findings should be based on fact. But I want to circle back
Yeah,
to another pitfall
please.
that kind of flows from after you've made a determination that you should be conducting this investigation.
Yeah.
Really, what's another pitfall to avoid there, your second pitfall, and that would be selecting the wrong investigator, right?
Ah.
And this is a question that people don't often think about, but it's really key, right? So we talked about typically investigation are done in-house by HR representatives. They can also be done by somebody external like myself. And
Mhm.
in California, if you are going to bring somebody external, it has to be a licensed attorney or a licensed private investigator. Those are the
Mm.
only two individuals that could perform that investigation externally.
So one wouldn't bring in an HR consultant to perform an
No,
investigation.
unless that HR consultant is also an attorney
Right.
or a licensed private investigator. Exactly.
Boy, that might be the
So,
nugget of the day. Or at least, I mean, maybe
yeah,
everyone knows that, and I'm just the one that's surprised by it. But that's,
yeah, you'd be surprised. Most people don't know that. Most employers don't know that. So this is a California specific rule. And if you're in another jurisdiction, you may have just different requirements for who can conduct the investigation externally. But in California, you are limited to attorneys and licensed private
well, and whether
investigators.
you're not in California, pitfall number two applies, which is ensure you have the right investigator. What right
Right.
investigator means in your area
Right.
might change,
I will
but
let you know. I will
yeah,
let you know what a right investigator means. So you have to look at every investigation separately,
yeah.
right? And determine whether you have the right investigator for that particular investigation. So let's say you have Mary in HR who is trained to do investigations. You can't just always say, well, we got Mary, that's our gal, she's going to do the investigation. The employer really has to ask three questions. The first question is this investigator impartial? So, what does that mean? Can this person make findings based on objecting weighing of the evidence, right? In other words, does this person have any biases that could
Right.
interfere with their investigation? So, Mary, our HR rep, she may be fantastic and she may have conducted investigations before, but let's say there's a complaint that's brought by Mike and it's known in the company that Mary and Mike are best buddies. They go out after work, they hang out and they eat lunch together every day. Their families know each other. It would not be proper for Mary to conduct this investigation of Mike's complaint, right? Because she's likely going to be biased in favor of
Also,
Mike.
probably worth Mary looking into going out with Mike so often. Come on, get your own friends.
True, but we make friends at our
Of course.
offices,
Maybe it's a
right?
brother
And
or something even. Yeah, right. Yeah.
right, so that's a really important question to ask. That's your first question as the employer. The second question as the employer is there a perception of bias? So perception, and I can't stress this enough, but in investigations, perception of bias is huge,
Yeah.
right? So let's say again, we have Mary, and in this instance, the complaint is against a high-ranking executive at Mary's company. Would it be perceived as there being a perception of bias if Mary conducts this investigation, given that this high-ranking employee can impact Mary's pay, can impact Mary's retention based on the outcome of this investigation? And in this instance, there would be a really strong perception of bias. And what this perception of bias can do is that it could actually impact the integrity of the investigation, right? Meaning that the findings of the investigation may not hold up in court, right? So in California, we have the Civil Rights Department, the CRD, and the Civil Rights Department is the enforcement arm that enforces our civil rights laws in California, including FEHA. And the CRD actually recommends that employees not investigate anyone who's ranked higher than them in the
Yeah.
organization.
That makes
And that
sense.
makes sense,
Yeah, it
right?
does.
That totally makes sense.
Is there a third thing to
Yep.
consider? Yep.
So the third question to think about is, and this is especially for California employees, California companies, is this particular investigator qualified or knowledgeable about the standard investigation practices, right? And this is a California specific question, but it's a really important question for all employers in other jurisdictions to consider as well, right? And so we're going to go back to the CRD again, and the CRD defines the standard investigatory practice as including, knowledge of laws and policies relating to harassment and discrimination, knowing how to question witnesses, knowing how to document the interviews, knowing how to analyze the information that's gathered, and then how to effectively communicate these findings to the employer,
Right.
right?
And so we're kind of starting with whether or not to conduct an investigation in the first place, whether the event or occurrence rises to such a level. And then when we do, who the right person to do that is and sort of what their
Right.
background is, and situation by situation, the right person, quote unquote, might change because maybe Mary is the right person in scenario A for this person, but it's definitely not, for a multitude of reasons, the right person for this other type of a scenario. I want to tease you to think about if there's another pitfall and then circle back to a question from when we were talking about you saying sort of what an investigation is and what it's not, right? It's not me levying a judgment. It's me trying to figure out most likely what were the facts on the ground. Do you have a couple of pointers if HR identifies this does deserve an investigation, and in this particular case, I am the right person to do this investigation, and evidently my goal of this is just to figure out, as a matter of fact, what is most probable to have occurred? What are some of the best tips and tricks to undertake that task?
Okay. So the first is to define the scope of the investigation. And what that means is, what is the issue that this investigator is going to make a finding of fact about, right? And the employer would make the determination, not the investigator. And what that means is that whoever is the appropriate decision-making channels would make the determination about the scope of the investigation, and then the investigator would make their determination based on that scope. And it's really important to determine your scope at the onset of the investigation. And then as the investigation is ongoing, if additional information is received that can impact this scope, right? To communicate that information to, again, these proper decision-making channels, right? And a final really key issue with respect to scope is making sure that you're not making a finding of law. And we talked about this a little bit earlier too. Again, as an investigator, you're not a judge, right? The judges take facts that they apply to laws and they make a determination of law, right? An investigator is just trying to determine what the facts are, what more likely than not happened in terms of the facts.
Yeah, yeah. How about then getting us back to our series of pitfalls? I know I'm kind of pulling you in multiple directions, and for anyone listening a little behind the curtain, these aren't pre-rehearsed conversations and questions. So I appreciate you being able to pivot and move around as I have these ideas pop into my head. But we were also kind of working our way through a series of pitfalls. I'm curious if there's anything else you'd want to get to as we kind of round the bend and keeping this to like our bite-sized, digestible commitment, stuff to kind of punctuate that we maybe haven't touched on yet that you think would be really germane to this conversation.
I think another pitfall to really consider is, forgetting that due process applies in investigations, and we hear that word often thrown around. And really, in the context of the investigation, what that means is fairness, right? Ensuring that all the witnesses are treated fairly and procedurally the same, right? So nobody is being interrogated. Everybody's getting open-ended questions. Nobody's led to believe that the investigator believes them while the investigation is ongoing. So if I'm having a conversation with Mike brought this complaint against Janet, and he tells me, what he asserts Janet did to him. And I say, oh my gosh, Mike, that sounds terrible. I can't believe Janet did that to you.
Right.
That's not fair. It's not fair to Janet. It's not fair to the other witnesses that may have seen this particular incident occur. And it's not fair to Mike because you're leading Mike to believe that he's in the right when you haven't conducted your investigation. So a really important thing to consider is making sure to check any, determinations that you have at the door.
Yeah.
Right. And not make any decision about the investigation, and certainly not communicate anything about the investigation until you've talked to everybody and looked at all the evidence and made your determination at the very end.
And as we've talked about a couple times today, reaching out to someone like you to make sure that we've got the right investigator in the right time might be a good practice. And if folks did want to get a hold of you, is LinkedIn, email, website, what's kind of the best way if someone's listening and says, literally, I need an investigator and hey, I like the cut of this gal's jib?
So I'm on LinkedIn, Sherli Frank. You can find me. I have my website, thrivingemployer.com. And yeah, easy to find me.
Perfect. Awesome. So we'll have folks reach out to you if they see this and it prompts them to be, maybe they're in that season. Otherwise, I just can't thank you enough for helping us kind of have this type of a conversation and get some of these best practices sort of put in the can so that the HR community can sort of have something like this to reference. And you're being so generous with your knowledge. So thank you very, very much.
No, thank you. This has been such a treat for me, getting to speak with you. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Cool. Right on. Well, that's all the time we have for you guys this week on the podcast. Blessed to be here. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Join us next week. Our sponsors, TrueHue, Excel Health, Montage Insurance Solutions help us keep the lights on. So we appreciate those guys as well. Join us next week. Join us every week. And until next week, make this the best week yet.